The year 1890 is significant because it marked the publication of his first full-length novel, The Snake's Pass. Its favourable reception possibly encouraged Stoker to begin preparing his magnum opus there and then, time and opportunity permitting. Far from being a casual yarn spun from the top of his head and recounted with only minimal preparation, Dracula would take a further 7 years before it appeared in book form. The Philadelphia notes are dated between 1890 and 1896. They were written on anything available, including Lyceum notepaper and even a piece of Philadelphia hotel stationery. It is, regrettably, still not clear exactly when the novel took its final form, for the earliest papers include neither the precise vampire theme nor the name of Dracula. Even so, the earliest dated note, 8th of March 1890, reveals that the initial chapters had taken recognizable shape in epistolary form, and a week later, on March the 14th, the plot is laid down, complete with 4 sub-books, titled To London, Tragedy, Discovery, and Punishment, each comprised of 7, later 9 chapters. This quarterly breakdown is suggested of 4 acts of a play, and the fact that the finished novel would contain most of the narrative in 2 multi-room dwellings, one in Transylvania, the other in London, as if inviting a future stage adaptation, suggests that Stoker was alive from the start to Dracula's theatrical prospects. Moreover, the chapter divisions frequently serve no obvious scene-separating function. Many chapter endings appear quite arbitrary and operate more as a curtain call, providing a pause at regular intervals. With regard to relevant locations in Britain, almost every place that Dracula stalked, Stoker had preceded him notebook in hand. He had toured Whitby, for example, scene of the Count's dramatic shipwreck, as early as August 1890, and notes taken then would appear almost verbatim in the finished novel. The tombstone inscription in the novel are authentic. He had also noticed the name Swales on a Whitby grave and lent it to one of his Whitby characters, giving him a dialect meticulously in keeping with the glossary of local terminology. He had chatted to the locals, listened to the tales of naval tragedies from old sailors, and consulted logbooks and meteorological records. Several actual shipwrecks were noted, including that of the Russian schooner Dmitri on the 24th of October 1885, which had crashed through Whitby harbour. In Dracula, Stoker's Russian ship would act likewise and be called the Demeter. Other first-hand field researches included a trip to Regent's Park Zoo, where Stoker observed the behaviour of certain animals, and to various other parts of London, which would feature in the book. His notes outline a theory of dreams, while from his surgeon brother, William, Stoker learned that the symptoms and treatment of specific head injuries, which he would later employ for Dracula's attack on Renfield. One of the latest additions to the notes was a newspaper feature entitled Vampires in New England, from a copy of the New York World, dated the 2nd of February, 1896. Having established the bare bones of his tale, Stoker now needed a location. It needed to be a truly dreadful place, a fitting haunt for a monstrous count. His early inclination seems to have been to borrow Le Fanu's sighting for Camellia, namely Styria, now in eastern Austria. But at some early stage he revised this location in favor of Transylvania, further to the east, the northern and western parts of modern Romania. His notes indicate his familiarity with the writings of Emily de Lazowska Gerard, whose articles Transylvanian superstitions which sketched out the local beliefs on vampires and devilry, he carefully summarized. Girard had also, in 1888, published a book on her expanded researches called The Land Beyond the Forest, the literal meaning of Transylvania, much material from which would find its way into the opening chapters of Dracula. As Stoker says through his mouthpiece, Jonathan Harker, I read that every known superstition in the world is gathered into the horseshoe of the Carpathians, and it was there that Bram Stoker eventually opted to base his vampire count. Further research was undertaken at the British Museum to supplement the many works listed in his notes as having been consulted. It is apparent from reading the novel that Stoker clearly used the calendar when compiling the plot. The journals and newspaper extracts all come from a particular year, but as he refers to dates, not days, there has been much speculation as to which it was. It has now been established beyond doubt to be 1893, for his notes contain the novel's timescale reproduced in a diary. This evidence lends weight to the suggestion that Cruden Bay occupies a special place in the inspiration behind Dracula, for it was first visited by Stoker in 1893. So much for the time and place in which Dracula was set. There remains the origins of the name Dracula, for in his early notes, Stoker refers instead to a Count Vampire. Popular wisdom apportions credit for this switch to a Hungarian professor. Stoker's reminiscences record that on the 30th of April 1890, he was introduced to a Professor Armias Vambray, a distinguished historian and Orientalist from the University of Budapest, who had just returned from an expedition to Central Asia following the steps of Marco Polo. A further meeting took place 2 years later in Dublin. The suspicion that Vambray played some part in Stoker's still crystallizing ideas stems from little more than the author's habit of taking real-life acquaintances and transplanting them, with little if any change of name, into his novels. In Dracula, when Van Helsing seeks a detailed picture of the demonic count, he requests assistance from my friend Arminius of Budapest University. This has led to the unwarranted presumption that fact mirrored fiction, that the real Armias Vambray supplied information on the real Dracula. Such a presumption is dangerous because Stoker's use of the nomenclature was, on occasions, inconsequential. Another of the cast of Dracula, for example, borrowed the name of a Lyceum painter and decorator, without there being any suggestion of a more profound association. What seems more curious about Vambray, vis-a-vis Stoker's researches, is that in most of the encyclopedias Stoker would have consulted, the entries Vambray and vampire are juxtaposed. Unfortunately, nothing is known of the content of Stoker's and Vambray's conversations or later correspondence, and if Vambray ever wrote on the subject of vampires or so-called Dracula, no record has survived. What is, finally, the most persuasive argument against the primacy of the Vambray connection is that all the important information in the novel on Dracula or vampires in general, and which is attributed in Dracula to Arminius, can be found in the books and articles listed in Stoker's notes. These notes do not mention Arminius Vambray. In other words, he may or may not have featured in Stoker's inquiries, but either way, it would appear that Dracula could have taken its final form without him. Stoker's working notes provide evidence of his first known acquaintance with Dracula. It transpires that during his vacation at the Yorkshire port of Whitby in August 1890, Stoker did not content himself with local researches. In Whitby Library, he came across an account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, written in 1820 by William Wilkinson, one-time British consul at Bucharest. On pages 18 and 19, Stoker was introduced to the activities of a 15th century Wallachian voivode, Prince Dracula. With this discovery and the researches that followed, the necessary ingredients of the novel were established. In a note dated 29th of February 1892, not only does the name Dracula appear as an original entry, but basic locations of the finished novel are mapped out. Whitby in England, and Bistritz and the Borgo Pass in Transylvania. Modern Romania comprises 3 provinces, Transylvania and, to the east and south, Moldavia and Wallachia, respectively. The historical links between these 3 regions are not recent. They date back to Roman times, from which the Romania derives its name. In medieval Europe, these 3 states existed as semi-independent principalities, being squeezed between the Holy Roman Empire, which extended over Central Europe to the west, and the encroaching tentacles of the Ottoman Turks to the south. The Orthodox heritage of the Romanian peoples was therefore simultaneously under threat from Catholicism and Islam. In such times, it was difficult for any ruler of a threatened principality to survive, let alone carve a name for himself in history. But Dracula was such a man. He was born around 1430 in the Transylvanian town of Sighisoara, but it was in the neighboring southern territory of Wallachia that he, succeeding his father, would eventually make his reputation. Around the time of Dracula's birth, his father was bestowed by Sigismund, the Holy Roman Emperor, with a title that would pledge him to devote his life to the service of combating the Czech Hussites and the Turks. He was granted the throne of Wallachia in absentia and invested with the Order of the Dragon, a semi-military, semi-monastic designation which, crucially, was to be hereditary. The Romanian word for dragon happens to be Dracul, pronounced Dracul, and the order's escutcheon showed a cross beneath which hung a dragon. The first holder of the office became popularly known as Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Dragon. Vlad Dracul presumably enjoyed something of a reputation. One source credits him with being a descendant in the direct male line of Genghis Khan. He managed in 1436 to seize the Wallachian throne, but his precarious balancing feat between his patrons and the Turks could not endure. In 1447, together with his eldest son Mircea, Vlad Dracul was put to death at Christian hands, whereupon the Wallachian throne passed to rival claimants. Vlad Jr. was in no position to contest the matter. For some years he and his younger brother Radu had been guests of the Ottoman hierarchy. It was while being imprisoned in various parts of Anatolia that the teenage Vlad came to learn at first hand the weight of Turkish methods, discipline, and barbarity, the psychological weapon of terror put to full use. The Turks, when confident that he had been cleansed of his father's duplicity and was fully indoctrinated with Ottoman virtues, saw in young Vlad a suitably pliant ruler of Wallachia, and with their approval he snatched power for a few brief weeks at the end of 1448. However, he was soon overthrown and forced to seek refuge in both Turkish and Christian lands before he found new sponsors.